Hi, welcome to episode 3 of Police the Police podcast. And just another reminder that we've made these podcasts in the hopes that you, the viewer, who doesn't think police brutality is an issue, or who don't think that police brutality is racially motivated, we make these in hopes that you, the viewer, will come to this with an open mind to listen to this and possibly have your mind changed.
Like Brian said, this podcast aims to argue that police brutality is an important issue in the U.S. that needs to be addressed. Specifically in this episode, we're setting out to discuss racism within the police system and how police brutality is often racially motivated and is disproportionately impactful to people of color.
If you have not watched the prior 2 episodes, we highly recommend that you watch them in order to get a better understanding of the full scope of our argument and a better context as well. In this episode, we will discuss the racist history of the police and how it is inevitable that this history still impacts the police force today. So that brings to the question, when was modern policing invented?
Our modern system of policing didn't always exist. The first police force was actually referred to as slave patrol and was established in the colonies in the early 1700s. They were tasked with keeping plantation owners in check and capturing and returning runaway slaves, as well as terrorizing slave communities in an attempt to prevent uprisings.
Over time, the police evolved into a more formalized force around the 1900s. However, this history is important to keep in mind when considering the police force today. The police were originally created in America for a racist purpose and have always targeted Black people specifically. So that brings to another question. What about after slavery ended?
That's a good question. After slavery after slavery was abolished, the Black Codes were passed in the late 1800s. Laws that were targeted against Black people for very minor offenses. Black people could be arrested for simply existing in the wrong place, for being homeless, or for being unemployed. These laws also promoted the segregation of Black people in housing and employment opportunities, as well as healthcare opportunities as well. And the police were expected to enforce this discrimination.
The original Black Codes evolved over time and are commonly referred to as Jim Crow laws until the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The 13th Amendment, which prohibits slavery, makes an exception for those who are incarcerated for committing a crime. Because of this loophole, the government sought out to imprison as many Black people as possible in order to covertly continue slavery, because cheap labor equals maximum profits.
Around this same time, the KKK and the police were very closely intertwined in many areas across the U.S. They still are today.
It was well known and publicly shared during this period of segregation that police were involved in the KKK, and if not involved, then sympathized with them. The KKK often relied upon police to protect and allow them to get away with illegal activities. Back then, it was more common to voice active support and proudly participate in the KKK, while today, KKK supporters do it in secret.
In fact, in a 2019 report by the Center for Investigative Reporting, they found that hundreds of active duty and retired law enforcement officers are members of Confederate sympathizing, anti-Islam, or anti-government militia groups on Facebook.
The Department of Homeland Security report in 2009 found that federal law enforcement agencies in general, such as the FBI, the Marshals, and the ATF, are aware that white supremacists have infiltrated state and local law enforcement agencies.
The FBI, in fact, released 2 reports in 2006 and another one in 2015, expressing findings about how white supremacists have been conspiring to infiltrate U.S. law enforcement in order to advance white supremacist ideology. The 2015 report states that white supremacist groups often have connection to law enforcement.
During the Civil Rights Movement, police were mobilized against protesters fighting for equality.
They used incredibly powerful hoses, rubber bullets, attacked dogs, and used physical force and violence, and sent hundreds of Black people to jail repeatedly for protesting. Many Black people died at the hands of police during the Civil Rights Movement.
We see similar acts of violence against Indigenous protesters today, especially during the Keystone Pipeline protests. Which brings us to our next segment, the war on drugs, a modern replacement for Jim Crow.
Jim Crow laws may no longer exist, but the war on drugs has a similar impact on the Black community. The war on drugs targeted Black people specifically. Nixon's aide even admitted it. Black people have disproportionate rates of sentencing and are over-policed disproportionately by police. So why does this matter? Many people point out that most of these practices have already ended, so they aren't relevant anymore.
This history is extremely important to keep in mind when analyzing whether or not the system of policing is racist. While it is true that slavery and Jim Crow segregation are no longer practices that we engage in, and the Black codes have been overturned, there's inevitably going to be some sort of impact that these practices have. This impact did not disappear when changed laws on paper, values, and patterns like this do not simply disappear without reform. And there has been no major reforms to the policing system since the Civil Rights Movement. Even without including the Slave Patrol and only looking at the Black codes, Jim Crow segregation, and the Civil Rights Movement, the police have actively trained to target Black people for approximately 200 years. If you include the period of slavery and the Slave Patrol, that makes it 350 years of police brutality specifically targeted at Black people. The Civil Rights Act was passed only 56 years ago, and with no major reforms made to the police service. It is simply illogical to think that these practices have absolutely no impact on how policing works today. The culture of policing is actively anti-Black, and reforms are necessary to change this.
Adding on to that, the red line parameters that are in place match up with instances of brutality, and the KKK is still highly involved in law enforcement, and hundreds of years of culture has left a significant impact on police culture.
And that brings us to our conclusion. So just a brief recap, the policing system was initially established for a racist purpose, and it has consistently been used for racist purposes for hundreds of years. Anti-Blackness has been consistently ingrained into police culture, and it is illogical to think that any of these effects would randomly disappear over the course of 50 years without any reform. In the next episode, we will look at how racism shows up in the police force today and explain how police brutality is clearly disproportionate for people of color. As always, thank you for listening.